Welcome to the What is Stoicism podcast.
Donald Robertson's new book, How to Think Like Socrates, will be a welcome release for anyone keen to delve into the life of the man often referred to as the grandfather of Western philosophy. Almost all philosophical schools after Socrates trace their roots back to him, including the Stoics. Within the work we get biographical detail, insights into Socrates' character, and ultimately an understanding of why he's still such a revered figure. How to Think Like Socrates takes a similar format to Donald's hugely popular How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, weaving in practical techniques derived from the Socratic method and cognitive behavioral therapy that can help with things like depression, anxiety, and anger. So not only does the reader become aware of how they might think like Socrates, they also find evidence for why that might be a good idea. In this episode, I talked to Donald Robertson about the book and what we can learn today from the way Socrates thought all those years ago. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So Donald, thanks for joining me again. I really enjoyed our last conversation about your Marcus Aurelius Stoic Emperor book. And today we're going a bit further back in time to talk about another famous philosopher. Your new book is called How to Think Like Socrates.
Yeah.
I've had a chance to read it, and I would really recommend it for anyone keen to get a sense of Socrates' character and, why he's still such a revered figure. And not only that, there's a lot of excellent practical techniques derived from the Socratic method and CBT and, help with things like anger and anxiety. But just to start anyway, for anyone who might be unfamiliar, I wonder if you'd briefly describe who Socrates was and maybe why there's some uncertainty about the details of his life.
Yeah, there's this thing that scholars call the Socratic problem. So he's a kind of problematic guy. He's always been a bit of a nuisance, Socrates, to people. That's why they made him drink hemlock. And he's a nuisance to modern scholars as well, because our main sources are most famously Plato. We have about 37 dialogues from Plato, give or take, one or two. And they're like little plays with minimal action and scene setting and mostly a lot of language, a lot of speech. But the dialogue format, in a sense, lends itself to dramatization and being semi-fictional. So it tells us things about what Socrates said, the sort of person he was, how he interacted with other people, but it's not intended to be a historical record. We also have a satire called The Clouds by Aristophanes, which was written and performed during Socrates' lifetime. And Socrates, we're told, saw it being performed. So you'd think that would be a really valuable source. But it paints a picture of Socrates that's completely unlike the way that he's normally portrayed by later authors. And, so we don't know how much we can take from that. It seems like it's a real caricature. And then we have Xenophon's dialogues. We have about 40 dialogues from another student of Socrates called Xenophon, an Athenian general. And then we have what's called the anecdotal tradition. So that's mainly little bits and pieces in later authors that are considered sort of more unreliable. But I'll give you an example. You mentioned Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius looked up to Socrates, but Socrates died, about 550 years, more than 550 years before Marcus Aurelius was writing the Meditations. So Socrates was kind of ancient history to Marcus Aurelius. And yet Marcus mentions anecdotes about Socrates that we don't find in any other source. So it could be that he's wrong, this is getting garbled by commentaries he's reading, or it might be Marcus is reading texts about Socrates that still existed in the 2nd century AD, but which no longer exist today. And he had a slightly different perception of Socrates than we do. So we have to wrestle with this problem of reconstructing Socrates' philosophy and his life from material that would be best described as semi-fictional. And we're not really sure to what extent it's accurate and to what extent it's fictional. Plato's most famous theory, which he attributes to Socrates in the majority of his dialogues, is the theory of forms, a metaphysical theory But other authors say that Socrates didn't do metaphysics. And Aristotle says that it was Plato, Socrates' student, that introduced the theory of forms. Now, Plato introduced it, and Socrates couldn't actually have taught that. So it's generally believed, although we're not 100% certain about this either, that Plato, particularly in his middle and later period, is using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas, whereas in his earlier dialogues, he may be portraying a somewhat more authentic picture of Socrates. So it is possible to try and reconstruct a story about Socrates' life and philosophy that's as authentic as we can make it based on those sources, kind of filtering out stuff that we think is unlikely to be accurate. But still, what we're left with, we can't really be completely sure. For somebody that had such a massive impact, like a dynamite, going off that changed the course of Western philosophy, ironically, we can never really be sure if our image of Socrates is the real Socrates. But what we can say is that the reconstruction that we can make of him, we could call it the literary character of Socrates, is what Marcus Aurelius would have been influenced by to a large extent. Like I say, he maybe knew other things that we don't know as well. But Marcus Aurelius never met the real Socrates. What inspired him and what inspired Epictetus and other later thinkers was the literary character of Socrates that we find in Plato and Xenophon primarily.
And you think then that the overall story of Socrates and like you say, they're sort of semi-fictional, and just like you've done in the book is, create some of your own dialogue. The story's maybe more important than what is strictly accurate.
I think the story is what matters, because it's the story that inspired. Socrates' flesh and blood presence, the real guy, actually inspired a lot of other philosophers. According to the philosophical tradition, there were 10 students of Socrates that went off and become famous philosophers in their own right. The three most famous were Antisthenes, Plato, and Xenophon, but there were others as well that some of them founded their own schools or published dialogues about Socrates. So the real guy had this impact on his immediate followers, the next generation. But after that, what influences the rest of Western philosophy is mainly Plato and Xenophon's version of him. So that's kind of what matters to us. That's what shapes the history of Western philosophy. And who is Socrates? Well, he's an Athenian. In a sense, he's the quintessential Athenian philosopher. He wasn't the first philosopher, but his importance is kind of highlighted by the fact that we divide the history of ancient philosophy into the pre-Socratics and then Socrates and the philosophers that followed after him. He's a watershed point, like BC and AD in history, in the history of philosophy. And interestingly, what ancient authors say he did that was distinctive was that he took the philosophical method and applied it to everyday questions of ethics. So he made philosophy more practical and down to earth. And in a sense, he made it more therapeutic. He describes what he's doing in Plato as a therapy for a particular type of philosophical and psychological problem, a sort of intellectual conceit. He was kind of although he was known for living in relative poverty, he was kind of middle class. He was a member of what's called the hoplite class in Athenian society. So he fought as an infantryman, as a citizen soldier, in at least 3 major battles of the Peloponnesian War. He was surrounded by movers and shakers in Athenian society. He was friends with some of the most powerful and influential people in ancient Athens. And most famously, he was put on trial for corrupting the youth and impiety in 399 BC and made to drink hemlock. And so he became a kind of martyr for philosophy, in a sense. The Greek word for a defense is apologia. So Plato's apology, and Xenophon also has an apology which survives today, describes Socrates' defense speech. But it's not a defense speech. Instead of defending himself, he stands up in court and defends the practice of philosophy. And he does it by doing philosophy, which is ironically the very thing that he's on trial for doing. He gets sentenced to death for doing philosophy, and he continues doing it in the court. That's just typical of Socrates. Everything about him is kind of paradoxical and ironic. So he's a very deep character, more so than Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is a very interesting guy, but he's quite one-dimensional by comparison. Socrates is like an onion with many, many layers. The more you study him, the more you realize there's more to find under the surface.
And do you think that people tend to appreciate just how influential he was to the later schools? Because, I sometimes worry that if I share something about Socrates, someone will say, that's not Stoicism, or, something like that. But essentially he came before them.
Socra who? Or something. I don't think people necessarily appreciate how important Socrates was. In the ancient world, he was generally considered to be, at the foundation of most of the major philosophical traditions. Not all of them. The Epicureans saw themselves as separate and distinct. Aristotle kind of is somewhere in between. He sees himself as having more eclectic inspirations. He doesn't really see himself as a prodigy of Socrates as such, even though Aristotle was mainly a student of Plato, and Plato was very much a student and follower of Socrates. Although even Plato had other influences. He seems to have been quite influenced by Pythagorean philosophy. So Socrates, nevertheless, is generally seen as an absolutely central figure. The Stoics, some Stoics at least, described themselves as a Socratic sect. So they viewed themselves as, very much following in the footsteps of Socrates, although their philosophy is slightly different. They're very indebted to Socrates. They may be more indebted to the Xenophon Socrates than to Plato's Socrates, possibly. So, for example, the Stoics have zero interest in Plato's theory of forms. Like the Stoics have more materialist philosophy, so they completely reject that part. And they were told that Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, was originally inspired to become a philosopher when he read the second book of Xenophon's Memorabilia, his collection of dialogues about Socrates. So he read the book in which Socrates is speaking, and that was what inspired the founder of Stoicism to go off and become a philosopher himself. But also, if you look at Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius and Seneca both mention that Socrates is somebody that they hold in very high regard as one of the great sages of history. But Epictetus goes much further and basically goes on and on about Socrates to his students. And Epictetus mentions Socrates, I think I noticed once, he mentions him something like twice as often, or more than that perhaps, than he does Zeno or Chrysippus, the founders of the Stoicism, or the two main founders of Stoicism. And Epictetus repeatedly tells his students that they should try to emulate Socrates and hold him up as their main role model. So Epictetus really seems to think that Socrates is kind of like the godfather of Stoicism, and we see him getting some name-checked and getting some recognition held up as a key figure by other authors. But in Epictetus, it's really explicit that Socrates is viewed as more important in a sense than Zeno, the founder of the school.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was Epictetus or Seneca, I think, said something like, you're not yet Socrates, but you should still strive to be like him.
Yeah, at least you can try.
Yeah. And so you talk about a healthy form of nostalgia that encourages people to follow the examples of the likes of Plato and Socrates, and the feeling that comes from laying your hand on the grass near the side of Plato's Academy, which is a great image. What I was sort of wondering based on that is, do Socrates and these nostalgic experiences, are they in danger of becoming obsolete as AI and technology advances, in the instant access to information, things like that? Or are they actually more important and more likely to be protected at all costs by those who still value them?
I think it's a hard question to answer. The one thing I know about AI is that everybody seems uncertain where it's leading us quite fairly rapidly. So, I mean, in the short term, I think it's easier to say what the consequence of AI is going to be. And I get the impression that the short-term impact of AI on publishing and the way that we consume philosophy is that people are possibly going to be subjected to a lot of misinformation about ancient philosophy. The internet is already absolutely awash with bogus quotations attributed to ancient philosophers. Some of the most frequently memed or whatever or quoted sayings attributed to Socrates and Marcus Aurelius are completely made up, or they're really quotes from other people that are misattributed to them, and in some case totally at odds with what they actually believed. And so AI tends to perpetuate that. It's got a habit of making quotes up at the moment, at least, and inventing even more bogus quotes, and then recycling those from other articles that it passes that have been published online. And also, interpreting classics seems to require a certain amount of nuance that AI struggles with, I think. So sometimes it gives a kind of conservative and quite superficial reading of ancient history and ancient philosophy at the moment. I've had a chance to kind of play around with it quite extensively. I mean, one of the games I played with AI was to try and make sure it disagreed with everything that I said at one point, and then I knew at least I was writing something that it wouldn't easily be able to replicate. But I would ask it tricky questions about the Peloponnesian War, and I would say it got about 80% of them wrong, right? If you ask it about more recent history, it's maybe got a better hit rate, but it seems to get quite confused about ancient history and ancient philosophy. So I think we're going to be subjected to a lot of misinformation and also kind of conservative readings of philosophy, not ones that really kind of try to penetrate deeper and go beyond the surface. AI's reasoning at the moment is quite wishy-washy. It's like it kind of tries to keep everybody happy and arrive at sort of compromise positions rather than, it's not going to come down in favor of Stoicism, for example. If you ask it to evaluate ancient philosophies, it will probably try and say there's something valid to all of them or something, really lukewarm and wishy-washy like that, which is, fair enough, but it kind of lacks edge. It's not really pushing the boundaries and trying to penetrate deeper into, you don't generally arrive at great philosophy by just agreeing with everything. Generally, you need a bit of debate, a little bit of edge. You need to have some teeth on you, like, to do philosophy. And
sort of Socrates method, really, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think we'll get a lot of bogus, superficial stuff. And, funnily enough, Socrates said many things about writing that are notorious and ironic, that sound really similar to things that you might say about AI today. So Socrates said he was concerned about writing because he thought it would make people lazy in their thinking and they would just read books and parrot what they'd read in books rather than questioning things and learning to think for themselves. He thought it encouraged rote learning and passivity. He said, all you get from books is a bunch of other people's opinions. It doesn't really teach you how to think for yourself necessarily, unless you also, in addition, ask yourself the right questions. I mean, that said, sometimes people say Socrates in the Plato's Phaedrus, for example, sounds quite negative about books and writing, but he was obviously extremely well read, and he quotes, he likes to quote from other authors. So he wasn't quite, completely negative, but he had kind of mixed feelings about writing. And those concerns are the same that people have about AI today. Already you can see people making a lot of decisions just by asking AI what they should do, and students at high school and university just using AI to write their assignments for them and stuff. We delegate our thinking to other people if we're not careful, and we delegate our thinking to AI if we're not careful. It has strengths and weaknesses. In some ways it can be a little bit more unbiased or impartial than we are as individuals, but it also tends to make silly mistakes sometimes, and like I say, in engaging quite superficial reasoning, at least at the moment. Who knows, 5 years from now, what it's going to be like, though.
Yeah, it's hard to say where it's going. You sort of hope that maybe it makes people crave that, personal interaction even more, really, as it becomes rarer.
I wonder, like, you might be that you're right about that. There is this trend in culture that people value authenticity. And so, maybe it makes a difference that people believe that ideas came from a real person who was flesh and blood. It might resonate with them more. But some people say they don't care, and they'd be quite happy to listen to music, whether it's been written by and performed by Johnny Cash, or whether it's been written by AI and, just made up by algorithms. Like, some people care, other people don't. It would be interesting to see, a few years from now, how that changes in society. If society is divided and people that crave authenticity and people that don't, or if we all tend to lean more in one direction. One problem that people will have, I saw somebody, who was it? Some expert, like, might even have been Elon Musk or something like that, I can't remember. Somebody on Twitter that I thought should have known better, saying that people will continue to buy books because they'll want works that have been written by a real person, right? I think that's a big mistake, because the first thing that will happen is that real authors will use AI to write their books. You won't know whether you're reading a book that's AI generated or not. It doesn't help to say that that's what people are looking for necessarily, because they're going to be inundated by, in the same way that many books currently are ghostwritten. So people believe that they're reading an autobiography or a book written by a particular person, but they might not even have read it. It's pretty common for celebrities to use ghostwriters. And the same way AI, people will be, think about it that way. Ghostwriters are probably in trouble, right? Because ghostwriting is probably going to just be replaced by much cheaper AI. So celebrities will get AI to, write their books or their biographies or whatever. They can just tell a bunch of anecdotes in a dictaphone and then let AI generate a biography out of it, or write a self-help book. If a celebrity wants to publish a self-help book, they just ask AI to generate it instead of having to pay a ghostwriter to do it for them. So you're going to see a lot of that kind of stuff happening. The first thing that's going to happen is people will be misled about how a book was created, and probably how a piece of music was created. But I wonder, it may still be that people go searching for authenticity, and maybe they'll want to hear authors speaking on podcasts and things, or see them in person more over time. But even that might be temporary, because you could, in the future, where there'll be videos that are generated by AI, it'll probably seem like it's the author that's speaking and it's not really. So it's hard to predict where it's going. But I think Socrates' basic point is that it robs us of the cognitive skill that really constitutes wisdom. It potentially just makes us all really stupid, because all we're doing is regurgitating. We're getting someone else to do our thinking for us, and that makes us very dependent on the technology that we're using.
Yeah, we just hope that it, as you say, maybe won't be a case where everyone is leaning in one certain way rather than a mixture of the two, which might be better when people can agree and disagree with each other. But in the book, you point out the difference between Socratic self-improvement and modern self-improvement, and that the former helps us ask better questions, while the latter usually claims to provide us with all the answers. So,
Yeah.
Just wondering if with your experience as a psychotherapist, or just in general, have you found that asking questions of oneself, at least as a starting point, is a more constructive approach to self-help?
Yeah, I mean, put it very simply, we have to think for ourselves. So I guess that follows on neatly from what we were just saying. There's a problem in self-improvement psychology whereby people learn roles for life. I mean, I hate to pick on an individual example, but it just so happens that perhaps the best-selling self-improvement book of the past few years is Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, which is very explicitly rule-centric. And the problem with rule-governed self-improvement is quite well known in modern psychotherapy. There are research studies that show that if you teach people maxims or rules to follow, like they'll often apply them quite rigidly. And, if you give a good rule to a wise person, they'll apply it wisely. If you give a good rule to a foolish person, they'll apply it foolishly. You have to have the cognitive skills to interpret rules, to select between them, to modify them and adapt them in the face of different situations. And it's really that ability to think on your feet that's integral to resilience and psychological well-being. We know that. Funnily enough, like one of the examples that Jordan Peterson gives of a rule that he thinks people should follow is virtually identical to one of the rules that Socrates critiques using his method. So he beat him to it by 2,400 years, basically. Jordan Peterson has a rule that says that you should always tell the truth, or at least never lie. And it may be that he interprets that in a flexible way. Although actually the foreword of his book valorizes rigid rule-governed behavior. It compares the type of rules he's talking about to the 10 Commandments. And the guy that wrote it is not Jordan Peterson. He's a friend of his, I guess, another author, says that, they're not called the 10 Suggestions. They're the 10 Commandments for a reason. Like young men in particular, he says, need rigid rules for guidance. And that's really at odds with what research shows in behavioral psychology, though, because when people are given rigid rules, they tend to apply them in a way that's insensitive to change in their environment. And so Socrates uses the example of always telling the truth with a young man called Euthydemus, who's a self-help junkie. He has a huge collection of self-help books. He says he's been memorizing the maxims of the wise, as he puts it, in order to improve himself. And Socrates says, well, can you give me an example? And he says that you should never lie, that lying is unjust. And Socrates says to him, as an example of using the Socratic method, what if you're an elected general and you lie to the enemy in the course of warfare? Is that unjust? And he says, well, that's different, Socrates, right? Obviously, that's kind of an exception to the rule. And Socrates says, I see. What if you're a parent and you have a small child and you try to give them medicine, but they won't take it, so you conceal it in their food? Isn't that deception? And he says, okay, Socrates, yeah, but that's different, right? That's an exception to the rule. And Socrates says, I see. So, and then he gives an example that's been famous throughout the history of philosophy. He says, what if you've got a friend who's suicidal? And he says, hey, where did you hide my knife? Would you think it's unjust to lie to him under those circumstances? And Euthydemus says, okay, I get your point, right? There's a lot of exceptions to this rule. And wisdom doesn't consist in memorizing the rule and following it, but in being able to spot the exceptions to the rule and think creatively and flexibly about applying it to different situations, right? So Socrates says you only develop wisdom. Wisdom isn't a bunch of opinions. It's a cognitive skill. And like you only get that skill by going to the gym and exercising every day. You only get that skill by questioning information and critically evaluating it, spotting contradictions in it. Like, memorizing stuff is going to make you like a robot. And, there is no maxim and no psychological coping strategy that is going to save you in every situation. In fact, the real problem would be if you've got a coping strategy for dealing with stress or anger that works 9 times out of 10, it's almost more of a problem because you potentially become quite dependent on it. And then if you lean too heavily on that one situation in 10 where it doesn't work at all, it's not appropriate. Like, rather than thinking creatively of a better way, adaptively of a better way to deal with your emotions, then you're potentially going to end up in quite serious problems. So coping strategies We know people cope with stress and anxiety in a bunch of different ways, by mindfulness, by cognitive restructuring, by using affirmations, visualization techniques, relaxation techniques, emotional acceptance, problem solving, seeking support from other people, like stuff like that, right? They're all different ways that someone might have of coping with stress. And no single one of them works in every situation for every person 100% of the time. So we know from research on stress that what helps people to become resilient is what researchers call coping flexibility. So that's their ability to choose selectively between different strategies depending on the demands of the situation. So a problem with self-help in general is it tends to just teach you formulaic strategy. It'll teach you relaxation techniques. It'll teach you mindfulness. It'll teach you how to use affirmations, right? And those work until they don't. You know, there'll be some situations where you need to come up with a different strategy and think on your feet more creatively. And it's the same also with roles. Clients in cognitive therapy come in with coping strategies. Like every therapist at the beginning of therapy will assess the client. And one of the first questions you would ask clients is, well, what are your existing ways of coping with anxiety, anger, stress, depression, whatever, pain, you know, whatever the problem is. And often the first step in therapy is to get clients to abandon their existing coping strategies, right? Because they may have got them from books, videos, or they just made them up themselves, you know, and often they work a bit, but then contribute to other problems in the longer term. So we need to get them to evaluate the strategies more carefully and think about alternatives. So, you know, I think what Socrates is doing, the sophists believed that the sophists were like a kind of weird hybrid of a self-improvement guru and a kind of political advisor, a speechwriter. And the first famous sophist was Protagoras, who came from the generation before Socrates. Socrates knew him, but he was a bit older than Socrates. He was called the wisest man alive by his followers, and people would pay a huge amount of money to go and listen to Protagoras, and he'd give a speech. And then you know what you'd do is you'd memorize his speech and repeat it. And as long as you memorized Protagoras' great speech and you repeated it to other people, then they would think that you were wise too. And he had maxims as well that you could pay and be taught, and you could often repeat them to other people. And Socrates said that when he met people in Athens, like politicians that claimed to be wise, he found out pretty quickly that they were just regurgitating stuff that Protagoras had taught them. And when he asked them questions about it, they had no idea how to explain, you know, these maxims or how to deal with exceptions or contradictions in them. So he says that's why he went to Protagoras. He said, I need to go straight to the horse's mouth and speak to the guy that came up with these ideas and see if he can explain the apparent contradictions or apparent exceptions to some of the things that he's saying. And he found that when he questioned the sophists, they often couldn't, because no one had ever really grilled them before. You know, they were saying things that sounded wise, sounded cool, and got a big round of applause. But no one had really tested these ideas or examined them really carefully. And that's what Socrates was famous for doing. So if you said something to Socrates that sounded really wise, he loved that. But he'd want to pick it apart, you know, not because he was being negative or critical for the sake of it, but because he thought wisdom actually consisted in the ability to notice the exceptions and pick things apart and like observe contradictions. If you develop that skill, then you're going to be able to apply it to any situation in life. You're going to become really good at spotting contradictions, you know, become really good adapting to different situations. Whereas if you depend too heavily on things you've been taught by other people, you become quite rigid in your thinking, and that definitely tends to lead to problems.
Yeah. Three 30 excerpts from the book just related to what you were saying there. The first one is, wisdom cannot be purchased at any price from the labor of other people. It can only come from our own efforts. And second one, when someone asked one of his followers what benefit he had obtained from studying philosophy, Socrates replied, or maybe it was one of his students replied that, the ability to hold conversations with myself. And then the third one is, for a true philosopher who loves wisdom more than anything, requires nothing besides the ability to reason in order to be happy, said Socrates. As long as he's asking someone questions, perhaps even himself, and examining their way of life, he's engaged in the highest activity that life has to offer. So you think that's where we go wrong sometimes when we're trying to engage in these kinds of things,
Yeah.
where we sort of gather as much information as possible and think maybe that is the self-improvement.
Yeah, and it's obvious to therapists. I'll tell you, one of the odd things that strikes me about Socrates, there are definitely things that he says that seem obvious to somebody who works as a counselor or a therapist, and kind of would resonate in that way. I think part of the reason is Socrates, all day long, every day, engaged in philosophical dialogues with people. But modern academic philosophers tend to write stuff more. They do attend seminars and things like that, but they spend a lot of time writing and lecturing. Socrates was more engaged in discussion with people. It was more dynamic. So the way that he behaved, what he spent his time doing, was more like a coach, in a sense, than a lecturer. And, he makes observations that a coach or a therapist would typically make. So I think definitely this is a more therapeutic benefit to people. It's also more beneficial for for Socrates himself to do philosophy in this way. I think in a way Socrates kind of felt sorry for the sophists, because they painted themselves into a corner. They were stuck. They couldn't admit they were wrong. Whereas Socrates, because he never claimed to be wise, he was just asking other people questions, he could change, adapt his views. He could think flexibly. He could admit that he was wrong. He could evolve. Protagoras could never really evolve as a thinker. He'd have to give everyone a refund. His wisdom is static, whereas for Socrates, it's more dynamic. And, certainly it's obvious when you see clients in therapy, that this kind of rigid thinking is very common. And it's problematic for them. I can give you many, many examples. But by the way, I'll just like a little aside, because you asked me about Stoicism. Not a lot of people know this, but actually, I'll give you another as an aside within an aside. Today on the internet, Stoicism is a phenomenon. It wasn't, 10, 20 years ago. It's become a kind of a subgenre of self-improvement. It's crystallized into a thing, where it wasn't really like that before. And there are people who seem to me to be quite evangelical about it. But the more evangelical people are about Stoicism, often the more kind of rigid and dogmatic their interpretation of it appears to me to have become. And one of the oddest things I find people saying is that they believe that the Stoics all had this kind of quite rigidly structured set of dogmatic beliefs. The Stoics were known as dogmatists, but they were also philosophers. It seems to me that first and foremost, they thought for themselves. They're in the Socratic tradition, right? So they had different opinions from one another that nevertheless were tolerated within the Stoic school. We hear quite a lot about disagreements among Stoics. Anyone that thinks Seneca and Epictetus are singing from the same hymn sheet completely, I think must be reading different books from me. It seems pretty clear to me that Epictetus and Seneca have a lot in common, but they also have very different emphasis. They're very different characters. They seem to be quite opposed in some regards to one another. Just imagine Seneca in a room with Epictetus having a conversation, right? It should be obvious that Epictetus has a very different perspective than Seneca. But as an aside, Seneca was Nero's biggest cheerleader in the Senate. Epictetus never mentions Seneca once, but he repeatedly mentions as moral exemplars the members of the Stoic opposition who stood up against Nero and were, essentially opposing Seneca at the same time. So there's a divide there probably between Stoics politically. Epictetus is probably on one side of it and Seneca's on the other. And we're told that by the time of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic school was perceived as having divided into three branches that were associated with the last three Athenian scholarchs, Diogenes of Babylon, Antipater of Tarsus, and Panetius of Rhodes. And they had separate groups of followers, like they represented different flavors of Stoicism. So it's possible Epictetus is following one of those branches and Seneca's following another one of them. And also, here's an aside, Epictetus tells us who his favorite philosophers are, and Socrates is one of them. But Diogenes the Cynic comes second. Seneca gives us a list of his favorite philosophers, and he mentions Zeno, Chrysippus, he mentions Socrates, but he doesn't mention any of the Cynics, and he does mention Plato. So you might, on the basis of that detail alone, think Seneca's into a form of Stoicism that leans more towards Platonism, and Epictetus is into a form of Stoicism that clearly leans more towards the Cynic tradition, even though they both admire Socrates. But right in the very beginning, there was a schism in Stoicism that I think a lot of people have kind of whitewashed or forgotten about. So after Zeno died, or possibly when he was elderly, Zeno chose Cleanthes to be his official successor in the Agora, in the Stoa Poikile. Everybody knows it was Zeno and then Cleanthes and then Chrysippus that were the first three heads of the school. But Zeno had another student called Aristo, and Aristo broke away from the main Stoic school and began lecturing in Kynasarges, which is one of the gymnasia outside the walls of Athens, which is kind of associated with, to some extent, with the Cynic school. And Antisthenes used to teach there, one of Socrates' friends and students. And so Aristo had a different branch of Stoicism that some people think looks in some ways a bit more like it leans towards cynicism, is less into theology. Cleanthes seemed really into religion. He wrote the hymn to Zeus. It seems, almost, he says we should continually sing hymns of praise to Zeus. It's very framed in religious language. Whereas we're told Aristotle completely abandoned the study of theology, and Stoic physics is irrelevant and a kind of misleading, and he abandoned the study of logic. So his form of Stoicism was just purely focused on the ethics. But we're also told that Aristotle was one of the most popular philosophers in Athens. He had far more followers than Cleanthes. So for a while, this kind of agnostic version of Stoicism was the most popular form of Stoicism. And then Chrysippus came along and I think restored the popularity of the succession that stemmed from Cleanthes. Although Chrysippus also lectured outside the Agora at the Lyceum for a while, where Aristotle's school was located. So there was like a lot of friction between the early Stoics as well. We're told, in fact, that Chrysippus disagreed with Zeno on almost every point. He said that he accepted the conclusions of Cleanthes but rejected most of his arguments. So even Chrysippus was radically revising what the Stoics that preceded him had said, and maybe kind of perhaps he was trying to find a middle way or some kind of way to resolve the split between Cleanthes and Aristotle. But the thing I was going to say about Aristotle is that we're not told many things about him, but one of the things we're told about him was that he believed that precepts were useless. So the Stoics had lots of moral precepts about how you should raise your kids, how you should run a business, like quite specific moral advice, rules that we should follow. And he said they're useless because if you teach precepts to a wise person, they'll apply them wisely. If you teach them to a foolish person, they'll apply them foolishly. He thought you need to teach people the core concepts that underlie ethics, and then they should be able to figure out the practical applications themselves. they'll apply these precepts too rigidly, these maxims too rigidly. It doesn't really help people to become any wiser, he thought. But you can see Seneca takes issue with this. And he thinks there's some truth in it, but moral precepts can be useful as a sort of like set of stabilizers on a bicycle, as a kind of temporary guide to people, as long as they don't become too dependent on them, as long as they learn to think about situations for themselves, reason about ethics. But in Stoicism itself, there's this tension between how much do we spoon feed people information. The Stoics were known for having lots of aphorisms and maxims, and I'd say in some ways Stoicism at times seems like it's a bullet point version of what Socrates was doing. Socrates raises all these questions and implies possible answers. The Stoics just kind of tease out the answers that Socrates implies and state them more dogmatically, generally. But some of them perhaps don't. Like perhaps Aristotle had more in common with Socrates. Perhaps he thought it was more important to teach people how to reason for themselves about ethics, and figure out how to deal with specific situations, rather than just telling them what to do and giving them a bunch of rules. And so the concerns that he had about rule following are similar to ones that you find in modern behavioral psychology, actually. So I say that because it may be that people that are interested in Stoicism might notice this that there are differences in what different Stoics believed. And different Stoics also have a very different tone, like a different approach. Seneca is not the same as Epictetus. Just imagine these two guys in the same room together for 5 seconds. Well, it would be a pretty weird conversation.
I think you would take a dim view of Seneca's wealth.
Yeah, I mean, Seneca's view about wealth is indifferent. And so there's nothing wrong with becoming fabulously rich as long as you use it wisely, right? Which is fairly consistent with Stoicism. It glosses over the fact that Seneca probably acquired most of his wealth as gifts from Nero, who was a violent dictator, arguably. Epictetus certainly thinks that Nero is like an animal. He's a wretched individual. So Epictetus would say, in response to that, accepting loads of money from despots and criminals, though, makes you morally implicated in what they're doing and dependent on them. And, so Epictetus warns his students, like, if people will have leverage over you, you enslave yourself to other people if you accept gifts from. This is quite a common idea in ancient philosophy. Seneca's kind of oblivious to that. He accepts big gifts. Not only does he, worse than that, not only did Seneca accept huge gifts from Nero and then become beholden to him, in a way that he probably regretted later, but Seneca got jobs for his friends and family members in Nero's regime. So Nero then was able to hold that over him. Epictetus is more the kind of guy that would say, just don't get involved with criminals. Don't get entangled with this stuff. Like you're unlikely to be able to handle it. He tends to see wealth as a temptation. So for Epictetus too, wealth is an indifferent, but the problem for all Stoics is love of wealth or avarice. And, Epictetus says, especially at the beginning of your training, you should avoid temptations. It's going to be extremely difficult for you to put yourself in the position of a politician with fabulous wealth and not be corrupted. The expression, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Seneca doesn't seem to know this expression, like this concept, right? That doesn't seem to really figure with him. Whereas Epictetus is more thinking along those lines. He says you can't serve 2 masters, right? You can't serve Nero and serve wisdom at the same time, because you're going to have to choose between them eventually, which Seneca found out, right? Seneca towards the end tried to distance himself from Nero, so Nero had him executed. Thrasea reputedly said, let the people that collaborated with Nero never be mentioned again, except to point out one fact about them, which is that they went along with Nero in order to save their own skins, because they saw his opponents being threatened with execution. But they ended up being executed themselves anyway, so they didn't even achieve that. So they didn't even manage to save their own skins, which was their one motive for collaborating with this regime. So Thrasea said that's the only reason we should ever mention these guys again, to point out that they didn't even achieve anything by sucking up to a dictator. He doesn't say who he's talking about, but I think it's pretty clear from the context that it can only be Seneca that he has in mind. He would be the glaring example of someone that collaborated with Nero. So I think one of the problems that we see Stoicism as a kind of dogmatic philosophy in a way, because the most popular book in Stoicism is Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And in that, what we get are the conclusions of philosophical reasoning rather than the process. So it's a book of aphorisms written for him to memorize. Marcus Aurelius probably attended many lectures and had mentoring from Stoics for decades and decades, where he was being questioned by them and engaging in philosophical reasoning. And this is the kind of output of that. So I think it could be slightly misleading when we read the Meditations. We don't see how he got to these conclusions. Whereas in Epictetus, we also get discussions that he's having with students. He's answering questions or elaborating on points they've been discussing. But at least in some of the discourses, we actually see Epictetus using the Socratic method with his students. For instance, there's quite a well-known dialogue where a government official, a magistrate, comes to see Epictetus, and Epictetus says to him, how have things been going for you in life with your family and stuff? And this guy says, not so well. And Socrates says, Epictetus says, what's the problem? And the guy says, well, my daughter was ill. We thought she was going to die. And it just freaked me out so much that I had to run away and abandon her and left her to the servants to look after, because it was just too upsetting for me. It was unbearable to watch her. And Epictetus questions whether this was really he justifies it by saying he thinks it was a natural response under the circumstances. Epictetus questions him, basically using a form of the Socratic method, and gets him to examine whether he really believes that that's a natural response and whether he considers it was the right thing to do under the circumstances. He also happens to expose the double standard in the guy's thinking. So he says to him, if you were dying, would you want everybody to abandon you? Is that how you'd like them to express their affection for you? And he said, do you think the people who love you the most should be the ones that are first to flee your bedside? And he said, no. Obviously I'd want them to stay with me and keep me, be with me when I was ill or dying or whatever. Of course not. That'd be ridiculous. And so Epictetus says, well, that's the opposite of what you said it was natural to do in response to your daughter. So you seem to have really contradictory ideas about how to express affection towards somebody who's sick or dying. This tactic of exposing double standards we see in Plato's and Xenophon's Socratic dialogues as well. I think it's important because it leads me to something else I want to mention to your audience. Sometimes people, I find today, I often hear people saying they love Stoicism. They find it really useful as a philosophy of life, but they find it hard to draw moral conclusions from Stoicism, because the precepts that you find in Stoicism might seem kind of dated, and sometimes the abstract ethical reasoning can seem a bit vague, and it leaves people unsure how that would guide them. The Stoics say that we should act with justice, but then modern readers will say, but what is justice? I'm still not sure how to interpret that in different situations. I think this, again, is a consequence of not using the philosophical method, because the process of Socratic questioning really revolves around identifying contradictions in our thinking. And one of the easiest ways to do that is in the example that I just gave, to identify double standards that we apply morally, right? So, it's easy for people to say what they think others are doing wrong. I mean, the sort of people that say they don't really understand what their duties are or how to interpret virtue are the sort of people that would sit all day long complaining about politicians on social media, right? It's easy for us to say what we disapprove of in the behavior of other people. But then if you disapprove of things, that implies that you value the contrary or the opposite. So if I can't stand the fact that politicians are dishonest, that implies that I value honesty in some sense, right? And, if I think that politicians should be more honest, then that kind of implies that, I should probably do the same in my own life. Otherwise, I'm going to be a bit of a hypocrite. I'm going to be applying a double standard. So this leads to this process of questioning contradictions and double standards, which is quite integral to the Socratic method. Again, we see Socrates doing it. Epictetus is doing it 500 years later, right? But people that read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius don't get that because they're not engaging in this kind of questioning process. If you do that, it leads to a particular moral principle, which again isn't the whole of morality. It's another precept, but some precepts are better than others, right? It's quite a broad one. It's quite it's quite a flexible one, and it's well known in history as a moral guideline. So having kind of criticized the use of precepts and maxims and stuff, I'll point to one which I think can be interpreted in a more flexible way and is very, very familiar. It stood the test of time. And Christians call it the golden rule. Like, it says we should do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And the reason the golden rule is famous is it crops up in almost every world religion and philosophical tradition. It's really obviously present in Stoicism and in the Socratic dialogues as well. But for Socrates, it's not just a dogma. It's kind of something that's implied by his very method. If you question people and highlight contradictions in their moral thinking, it's generally going to lead towards something like the golden rule. If you question double standards in people's thinking, like, it's going to lead to something resembling the golden rule. And the golden rule is very simple, right? But it does require some interpretation. How do you do unto others as you would have them do unto you in different situations? You have to think about what that means and how to interpret it. So I hate to break it to you kids, but you're still going to have to think for yourselves, like, about how to do in different situations. But it gives you, the core of it is removing hypocrisy and living in a more consistent way. The Stoics believed consistency was one of the markers of the sage. He wasn't going around contradicting himself. Right? They thought the most obvious sense in which we're foolish is, when we vacillate and contradict ourselves a lot. The sage has got things worked out. He's thought things through. Like, he comes across as if, like, he spent a lot of time thinking about things. He's thought his worldview is more coherent. It's not just a bunch of random opinions that he's got off the internet. I'll give you an example, a famous example. It's in Xenophon again. There's a young guy who comes to Socrates called Critobulus. He's actually the son of Crito, Socrates' best friend, his lifelong friend. Crito and Socrates came from the same suburb of Athens. They grew up together. And Crito was there at Socrates' trial and his execution. And he wrote Socratic dialogues, we're told, although they're all lost today. And all of his sons, I think he had 4 sons, they all studied with Socrates as well. So one of them, called Critobulus, came to Socrates and said, Socrates, could you help me make friends with important people? Find appropriate friends, find the people that would be good to have as friends. Because Socrates knew everybody. And Socrates said, sure, let's start off by defining what constitutes a good friend. And Critobulus thought this was kind of a bit of a silly question because it seemed fairly easy to him. He said, well, someone that lends you money when you're broke and comes and visits you when you're sick, and, that maybe kind of corrects you if you're making mistakes about important stuff. Someone who's there for you. And Socrates says, yeah, that seems like a reasonable definition of what constitutes a good friend. This sort of friend that, it'd be wise of you to seek out in life. He says, so I just have one other question for you, Critobulus. Critobulus is like, sure, what's that? And Socrates says, how many of these qualities do you possess yourself? And Critobulus is kind of stumped by this. He says, well, not many. Maybe 0, maybe. And so Socrates says, you've got this whole conversation back to front then in a way, haven't you? Rather than asking me to introduce you to good friends, which would require me telling them that you're a good friend and deceiving them, and that would backfire because eventually they'd figure out that you don't have any of these qualities. And then not only would they be annoyed with you, but they wouldn't trust me as a matchmaker of friends anymore. It would make more sense if you came to me and said, Socrates, could you show me how to become a good friend? How to become virtuous, in other words, right? Because you seem to know what the virtues are, but you're more concerned about whether other people exhibit them or not than about learning how to develop them yourself. And so, this is, in a way, he says, you've got this back to front, right? But so does everybody. We all have this back to front. We all spend a lot of time criticizing other people's character and not that much time trying to improve our own. It's like a big blind spot that we have. But Socrates was quite adept at highlighting that. And so by the end of this conversation, he persuaded the Critobulus that he should work on becoming a good friend himself, the sort of person that other people would want to have as their friend, a good person, a virtuous person, basically. But that's an example of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You want other people to treat you in the way that you've described, then you should go first and exhibit those qualities yourself. And, this is a theme that runs through the Socratic dialogues. But I mention that because people often seem a bit lost in terms of finding a kind of sense of direction morally from their readings of Stoicism. It comes from the Socratic method and the very process of questioning, I think. And, the direction it will give you is, pretty solid. It just says, don't be such a hypocrite. Nobody really admires hypocrites or people that contradict themselves or have double standards. We pretty much all agree on that, right? And by applying that principle, you end up with something that resembles the golden rule. Basically, it's kind of another way of framing the same thing. So I think, we can see that in the Stoic writings as well. Seneca talks about this idea in particular. And I think, it's a therapeutic idea as well. Because, sometimes we will treat other people more harshly than we would wish them to treat us. Sometimes we treat them more rigidly. I'll give you an example of where a role can become rigid and unhelpful. So in therapy, in cognitive therapy, we typically identify what clients' underlying beliefs are. And they often take the form of must, should, have to statements, demands that they impose on other people or themselves, but often it's on other people. And so they say, other people have to respect me. And if they don't, I'll get angry because that's just unacceptable. It's unbearable. And that's the sort of thing that becomes a recipe for neurosis if you hold that belief too rigidly. It seems reasonable. It seems reasonable to say that you'd like other people to respect you. But if you demand that other people respect you and they don't at some point, inevitably, you're going to blow a fuse. You're going to get angry, right? It's a recipe for neurosis. But it's useful to ask, what would it be like for other people to apply that role to you? Like, how would you feel if other people said that you have to respect them, and if you don't, they're going to get angry? Well, you'd probably start to say, well, they need to modify it a little bit because their idea of respect and mine might be different, right? There might be misunderstanding. There might be miscommunication, right? There might be forms of respect that they think are important that seem kind of trivial to me, right? And vice versa. So there's a lot of scope for misunderstanding there. So we if we want to get along with each other, we should probably build some kind of flexibility into this role. And that would make sense. If you think other people can have a rigid demand that you have to respect them in the way that they define respect, you might think, well, that seems a bit unfair. Like, I don't know what their expectations are necessarily when it comes to respecting them, right? But when we apply the rule to other people, we tend to do it quite rigidly. So again, getting to think about this from the perspective of double standards is quite useful. For many people, that's key as a way of alleviating anger that they have towards other people. They're more rigid in the demands on other people than they would like other people to be towards them, and that tends to lead them towards becoming quite enraged and angry towards others.
Yeah, there's a relevant part of the book, I think. You talk about clarifying our values and how people can become depressed because, they feel empty or meaningless because they've strayed too far from their core values. And what is the first step of that is to actually define them.
Mm-hmm.
But just to move on from that, you point out that we no longer have a word in English to describe eudaimonia, which will be related to Stoicism in a way too. But the Greek philosophers took it to be the most important thing in life. And, maybe that's a sign that in the intervening centuries, we've grown more complacent or dependent on the opinions of others and neglect to reason for ourselves, as you've, been talking about.
Yeah.
But what is
the most important thing in life?
Yeah. And which definition of eudaimonia would you prefer?
I think the Socrates implies, and the Stoics just straight up state, the Stoics tend to just spit out what Socrates often seems to be implying by his questioning. So the Stoic position is that eudaimonia consists in virtue, or if you like, wisdom. For the Stoics, virtue is moral wisdom, right? So you could just say that eudaimonia is a form of moral wisdom, basically, in broad strokes. So eudaimonia is this condition. I mean, it's conventionally translated as happiness, right? But that's a very misleading translation. And it's partly a misleading translation because the word happiness used to mean something different in English. Did you know that?
Yep.
So have you ever heard the word hapless? Like somebody might be described as a hapless individual. Yeah. And so when we say someone's hapless, we mean they're kind of unfortunate or wretched, right? Well, hapless is the opposite of what happy used to mean. So it used to mean flourishing or fortunate. They're doing well, like someone that's happy. Whereas now it's just a feeling. So a good way of explaining the contradiction is that a heroin addict might be really happy, like when they're high on smack, but but we would also say that perhaps that they're hapless, in a hapless condition, right? And the original meaning of happy, they wouldn't be described as happy. They're not doing well. So we've confused this. Again, in a sense, we've confused appearance and reality. Feeling happy is kind of the appearance or the illusion of doing well. Like happiness is the feeling that we're doing well. But that's not the same as the reality that we're doing well. Like when you're high on drugs, it feels like everything's great, maybe. But from an outside perspective, it might not look like you're flourishing at all. It might look like things are going quite badly for you. So we've confused appearance and reality, basically. And in the most important sense, we confuse appearance and reality when it comes to our well-being. Albert Ellis, the founder of cognitive behavioral therapy, used to say there's a difference between feeling better and actually getting better. You feel better when you take drugs, but that's not the same as getting better. What we mean today by happiness is like feeling better, similar to feeling better. What the word happiness originally meant is closer to getting better, flourishing or doing well. So eudaimonia, in a sense, it's easy to define in ancient Greek because it's the condition of somebody who's living the best possible life. It's the condition of someone who's living the good life. So the ancient Greek text says someone who has all of the intrinsically good things. And so it depends whether you think that wealth and reputation are integral to living a good life, as some of the Aristotelians did, for example, or whether you think virtue is the only thing that really matters in terms of living a good life. I mean, one of the questions that the Stoics, I think, were conscious of is, if you believe, like some of the Aristotelians, that a certain amount of wealth and reputation and other external goods are necessary in order to flourish, does that imply that Socrates, who was ridiculed in public and condemned by satirists, attacked in the street and condemned to death by the court, would have had a better life if he'd had a better reputation? You know, what makes Socrates great, in a sense, is the fact that he had a bad reputation about town, and, you know, he exhibited his greatness by rising above that. Like, would Socrates' life have been made better if we gave him more money? It's an odd question, because in a sense what made Socrates great was the fact that he lived in relative poverty and flourished regardless of that. So it's an interesting thing to puzzle over. So eudaimonia, I think, consists in this ability to flourish by having moral wisdom, self-discipline, integrity, courage, you know, and the other virtues. And for Stoics, that's the only thing that ultimately matters.
It's probably exemplified by something he touched on at the start in the Apology, when there's some sense in which Socrates could have probably got himself off or got away with exile or something like that if he had, argued his case in a different way. But as you say, moral integrity, he stuck to, what was true to his own character and did philosophy in his own defense.
Seneca mentions this paradox that when it comes to the virtues of self-mastery, courage, and self-discipline, some people think that being courageous means having no fear at all, and self-discipline means having no unhealthy or excessive desires at all. But Seneca says you need to have anxiety in order to exhibit the virtue of courage. Otherwise, you'd just be like a machine or a robot. And you would need to have some degree of temptation or desire in order to exhibit the virtue of self-discipline. I mean, you're not exhibiting any self-discipline if you don't desire anything in the first place. There's no self-discipline involved in refraining from eating food if you're not hungry. And it doesn't appeal to you. Like, you're only exhibiting self-discipline if you're really hungry and it really appeals to you. But for whatever reason, you restrain yourself from indulging in it. And I mean, luckily, there's many opportunities to, face temptation and confront fears in life. But Seneca says, many people have the misconception that the sage would be devoid of fear and desire, whereas in fact he kind of, in a sense, needs to experience them, or at least needs to experience something similar to them in order to have the virtues that we admire. Nobody admires a robot, for having self-discipline and courage, because it doesn't have fear and desire to conquer in the first place. So I think, it's useful to think about. There's another paradox that I think is very important, and I'll mention it because I think many people are confused about this today. In Plato's Phaedo, he talks about this. He depicts Socrates saying that people often confuse courage with recklessness, and it's difficult to understand genuine courage because in many cases, people appear to exhibit courage, but they're only doing it out of a form of cowardice. So some people face fears and do dangerous things because they're terrified of something else. Like, in battle, somebody might fight courageously against the enemy because they're absolutely terrified of being captured and enslaved, So does it make sense to say that someone's courageous if they're courageous or their bold actions are driven by a deeper fear. It's easier even to see it in the case of self-discipline. You know, someone might exhibit tremendous restraint because they're really greedy. And, so is restraint in the service of greed really a virtue? Also, criminals, um, you know, someone could be a very self-disciplined child torturer or a courageous, appear to be at least a courageous despot and genocidal maniac. But we wouldn't necessarily describe that as virtuous. Something only becomes a virtue of courage or the virtue of self-discipline if it's connected with wisdom and justice. Like Socrates believed all the virtues are one. They all have to be present and interconnected in a way. I mention that because at the moment, there are influencers that are into Stoicism and similar things who kind of divorce it completely from moral wisdom and social virtue. So a lot of people say, I'd get into Stoicism as a way of developing self-discipline because it helps me in my career to make lots of money and stuff like that. I mean, even Andrew Tate has a video talking both about Bugattis and about Stoicism, which seems like a bit of an odd combination. So he sees Stoicism as a way of becoming a millionaire. So Socrates and the Stoics would say, these guys are talking about something that kind of superficially appears like self-discipline or courage, but it's not. In the same way that a criminal might seem courageous because they do dangerous things in order to commit crimes, but nobody would say that that's a virtue. I think it's when we look at virtue in a superficial way and we see the virtues as disconnected, we can get quite misled about, what the goal of life is, basically. These guys make a virtue out of self-discipline and courage in isolation. But for the Stoics and Socrates, that's not real self-discipline and courage at all.
Yeah, I had this question already noted beforehand, but kind of summarizes maybe what you've just been saying there. Could our desire to appear wise be one of the greatest obstacles to acquiring real wisdom?
Yeah. Socrates thought it was important to be able to admit that we're wrong. He says so. The Epicureans actually were also known for saying this. Epicurus said that in a philosophical debate, I mean, also the internet. The internet's a really good reference point for just like everything that's wrong. Like in some ways, right? It's full of examples of people doing the opposite of what ancient philosophy recommends. So it's rife with people who think that having a debate is the way to settle the truth. So there's loads of debates between like Richard Dawkins and various people that are religious, or Jordan Peterson and various people this is like a form of entertainment on the internet now, which is fine. But I think we have to be careful to avoid falling into the trap of thinking that in any way settles the truth. Like people that win, those are rhetorical debates. And the people that win them aren't necessarily the people who are most correct, right? It's like ancient sophistry. Like there's a knack to winning debates by impressing the audience. That's not how we do science, for example. We don't say, let's have a YouTube debate about it and that'll settle the scientific facts about sort of questions in mathematics or, that. It's not a very efficient way of arriving at the truth. Because there are many tricks that people use to win rhetorical debates, that are very effective. And that's always been the case. So, I think, we have to be cautious about that. In a way, philosophy evolved to teach us skills to protect ourselves against being misled by rhetoric. But the fundamental problem is the desire to always win and appear right by impressing the audience, where Socrates was quite happy to appear wrong. He said, you'd be doing me a favor if you could convince me that I'm wrong. Epicurus said, likewise, that the person who gains most from a philosophical debate is the one who loses it. That the sophists, that would blow their minds. They think about this for a moment. Think how far removed. They made a fortune by training people how to win debates by any means possible, right? By using the ad hominem fallacy, by presenting facts selectively, by being woefully obscure, by derailing the argument, by evoking fear, anger, and greed in their audience, and then playing to those emotions, by appealing to popular opinion, appealing to authority. All these tricks and tactics are used in the kind of YouTube debates that people watch today. They're all ways of manipulating the audience into believing things that aren't necessarily true. But, there's a whole toolbox, a whole armamentarium of techniques that rhetoricians or YouTube influencers today or politicians, use to persuade people to agree with them. Socrates thought everything they're doing is geared towards appearing to win the debate. But really, in a sense, it could all be seen as a defense mechanism against ever admitting that you're wrong. Like, this is how frightened small men conduct themselves. They put all of their time, all of their effort into bamboozling people and trying to avoid ever admitting that they're wrong about anything or ever changing their opinion. Socrates thought philosophers need to be more receptive. They need to be constantly evolving, changing their opinion. They need to welcome people that manage to prove them wrong, because that's the only way that they grow. And again, I guess it comes back in a sense, this idea that wisdom consists in being able to say something and have an opinion that sounds wise. Whereas for Socrates, it's more of a cognitive process. It's an ability to grow, to spot contradictions and move beyond them. It's dynamic. Socrates also said that we should be as we wish to appear. You could say that, I guess, a hallmark of his philosophy, or a theme that runs through it, is that we're constantly tripped up by the difference between appearance and reality. Like, the whole point about appearances is that we're suckers for them. We're duped by them. So we have to make an effort and use reason to see beyond appearances. And, because appearance is so important and we're duped by it ourselves so often, if we're not careful, we become preoccupied with cultivating our own appearance, and trying to persuade people. Like, Critobulus wanted other people to see him as a friend. He wanted to get Socrates to persuade other people that he'd be a good friend, right? Rather than just actually being a good friend. Socrates said it would be easier in a sense, and certainly much better for you, just to become the thing that you wish to appear. You want to appear wise? Become wise, right? It's a much healthier attitude to adopt. But still, today, I think a lot of self-improvement advice is about cultivating appearances, about managing your image, it's about appearing confident. That's something I think we should be inherently quite wary about. It's fundamentally leading us in the wrong direction.
Marcus Aurelius picked up on that somewhat too. I think he said, if anyone can show me I'm wrong, then I'll gladly change. Just following on from what Socrates was saying too. Don't want to take up too much more of your time, Donald. Just wanted to ask you if you have a favourite story involving Socrates that exemplifies his character. I know there's probably many that come to mind in the course of your research and things like that, but is there anything that stands out?
Let me think. There's lots of really cool stories about Socrates. I'll tell you one just because this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's of interest to people. I've spent quite a lot of time in Greece, mainly in Athens. And, a lot of people, I just came back from Athens actually. I've been twice this year. And people often ask me about going there. You've seen in the book I talk about some of the locations. But there's some really cool stories about things that you can still see in Athens, places that you can visit that tour guides never tell you. There's no signs up. even if you go to Plato's Academy Park, there's not really that much there telling you about. There's nothing there that tells you that Plato was buried there. His remains probably are dust now, but in a sense, or he might still be under our feet when we're walking there. There's on the side of the Acropolis, there's a theatre called the Theatre of Dionysus, and it's where the ancient Athenians would perform plays in honor of the god Dionysus, an annual festival. And one of the plays that was performed there, which came last in the competition, is The Clouds of Aristophanes. And it's a play I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, which makes Socrates out to be a sophist and also a bit like a natural philosopher, like one of the pre-Socratics. Like they were really confused about who he was at this point and confused him with the people that he disagreed with. And they say that Socrates had a school, a building called the Thinkery, and he charged huge fees for students to come there, and he would teach them kind of like nonsensical stuff. And so this play makes Socrates out to be a buffoon, and it was performed. You can still go there. Thousands of people would have attended. People came from all over the Greek world to see those plays. So it would be like being like trial by media in a way. He was being absolutely roasted and lampooned by, it'd be like SNL or something like so. That's hugely the most popular satirical thing. Actually, and in that year, there was another play about Socrates, which is lost now. So there were, I think, 3 plays performed, and 2 of them were sat there. So the one thing that does tell us is that Socrates, by this point, must already have been a really famous public figure. The story goes that Socrates was being lambasted in this play, and there were 2 people from another Greek city there, essentially foreigners or visitors from outside Athens. And one of them turned to the other one in the middle of the play and went, "Who the hell is this Socrates guy? He sounds like a real buffoon. They're like tearing it apart in this play. Who is this guy?" And Socrates was sitting beside them. According to legend, he stood up and introduced himself to the audience. He kind of gestured to himself and he said, "Face it, yeah, this is me." And just kind of smiled at the audience and sat back down and watched the rest of the play. Like he was so indifferent to the fact that they were absolutely humiliating him on stage. He was like, "Oh yeah, that's me." It was like water off a duck's back to him that he would actually stand up and say, yeah, that's me, rather than, "How dare you?" Yeah. So that's, you can go there. I don't know if that's story. Again, it ties into a lot of the things that we mentioned earlier. Is this story true? It's part of the anecdotal tradition. Sounds made up, right? Sounds kind of too good to be true. Like it's sort of like hearsay. Yeah, did you hear what Socrates did? But what's true about it is that Socrates may well have attended these plays satirizing him. Thousands of people did. They were performed multiple times. And, he was there. It was done during his lifetime. It's quite plausible. I'll give you another example. That's not so much about Socrates himself, but just shows something that's kind of intriguing about the correlation between archaeological and textual evidence. So often we read things in ancient sources and we think, that can't be true. So classicists sometimes can be quite cautious about taking things at face value. They're always warning us not to do that, right? I mean, for example, a lot of the anecdotes we have about Diogenes the Cynic look like they come from satires. And actually, we know that some of them do come from a satirical play. So it might be like we have this image of Diogenes, and really what we're getting is kind of folklore or a kind of myth, basically. He didn't leave any writings behind, although he reputedly did write some stuff. None of it survives. But most of all, we mainly know about Diogenes from fragments that look kind of dubious. So Socrates, sometimes we don't know how to take the textual evidence, whether to trust it or not. But occasionally there's archaeological evidence that turns up that confirms it or seems to. So there's a story that Socrates used to spend his mornings at the gymnasia, like these kind of recreational parks in Athens, doing philosophy. And then in the afternoon, he'd go to the agora, where all the shops were and the public buildings in the city centre. And then in the evenings, he'd go to his friends' houses and carry on doing philosophy. And when he was in the agora, he'd often hang out on shops that were around the periphery. I think where a lot of the youth of Athens would socialise. So the agora was a bit like a mall in a way, right? It's quite strange that someone would hang out. It'd be like hanging out in a mall every day and doing philosophy with random strangers. And one of the people that Socrates was friends with was a guy called Simon, who owned a cobbler's shop, a shoemaker. And that seems kind of quaint because Socrates was famous for going barefoot. And actually several of his followers also went barefoot. So all these guys that never wore shoes are hanging out in a cobbler's shop, discussing philosophy all afternoon. Like, that sounds like it's from a satire, right? Sounds a little bit quirky. But one day, the archaeologists who were excavating the Athenian agora found the remains of a shop. They found many. And among the rubble, they found iron nails that are used to make boots. So they thought, looks like this is a cobbler shop. And then they unearthed something that's pretty common to find, which is a terracotta fragment of a Greek wine cup or a calyx. Now, the cool thing about the calyx or wine cup is that people would often engrave their name in the base of it. So this is like, this is my cup. And they found just a fragment from the base of this cup has the name Simon scratched on it. I mean, to the people who uncovered that must have seemed like, did somebody hide this here? Was this a prank? It's literally got the guy's name written on it. And you can see that fragment in the Stoa Attalou, which is houses at the Museum of the Ancient Agora in Athens. So it may well be that there actually was a shoemaker called Simon. And perhaps Socrates really did sit barefoot in a shoemaker's shop all afternoon talking about philosophy to his customers. We're told also that Simon was the first person to write Socratic dialogues because he used to keep a record of all the conversations that he heard Socrates having. But all of his dialogues are lost to us now. We don't really know anything else about him.
So that doesn't tell us so many things are lost, isn't it? In terms of texts and other artifacts that may never turn up.
Well, less than 1% of ancient literature in general survives today, and less than 1% of the Stoic literature. So, for instance, we have mainly just fragments from Zeno and Cleanthes. We mainly have Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus. Epictetus's words is written down by Arrian. We've got a few other bits and bobs. Cicero, who wasn't a Stoic, is one of our main, a really important source, but kind of commenting on, responding to Stoicism. We've got some fragments from Hierocles, another Stoic. We've got a book about theology by a guy called Cornutus that was a Stoic. We've got a few other bits and bobs like that. But we know the names of about 70 or 80 Stoic teachers and authors, first of all. Right, so we've only really got a significant amount of stuff from like 3 of them, basically. So that's, first of all, shows how little we've got. Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, wrote 700 books. None of them survive. And in ancient world, they were considered the most important to influential texts on Stoicism. We don't have any of those. Zeno wrote a number of books that were very influential. We don't have, we've got virtually nothing, like just a few dodgy fragments and testimonia relating to what he said. So overall, it must be less than 1%. Now, that's another reason why I think people who are very dogmatic about Stoicism, there's something inherently flawed in that position. So they'll say often, all the Stoics believe this, all the Stoics believe that. We're right out of the gate on very shaky ground saying that, because we're basing it on less than 1% of the original literature from, 3 out of about 70 of the famous Stoics who once existed. So we should say, as far as we know, like these were typical beliefs of like some of the Stoics held. I mean, there's good reason to believe that we can reconstruct some of the central doctrines, but it goes too far to claim that all of the Stoics believed the same things. That seems really unlikely to me. The picture I have of Stoicism is a much more dynamic and diverse philosophical movement. Like maybe that most of them were pantheists, but the textual evidence suggests that they weren't all pantheists. So we're told, for example, that Boethius, one of the Stoic authors and teachers that was quite influential, was specifically not a pantheist. And there's others, fragments that cast doubt whether some of the other Stoics were as well. Aristotle probably wasn't a pantheist, or at least he probably was agnostic, or suspended judgment about it. But yeah, again, you'll get this kind of idea now that Stoic theology is something that's carved in stone, and that it was a rigid dogma that, like the Ten Commandments, or something that everybody had to adhere to. That really isn't supported, it seems to me, by the textual evidence.
It all really goes back to the same thing, doesn't it? It's question yourself and question the world around you too. If we learn anything from Socrates.
I would say also, like, if you're reading Epictetus, who are the people that Epictetus holds up as role models? Socrates, Diogenes the Cynic. These are people that were prior to the Stoics and didn't hold the same theological beliefs as them. The very fact that he's willing to hold up such a wide range of people as moral exemplars shows that for Epictetus, virtue is the most important thing. Shock horror. I mean, I would have thought anyone that's read Epictetus, that'd be glaringly obvious. And that if someone said to Epictetus, I'm not completely certain that the universe is ordered by a rational, provident being that's coextensive with the material universe, like Stoic pantheism, I'm not sure about that. Like maybe, but maybe not. I don't think Epictetus would kick him out of his school and say, I think he'd be more interested in whether somebody exhibited courage, virtue, integrity. I thought that's crystal clear from the things that he says. If Diogenes the Cynic had turned up, had traveled through time, and he was like, I'm not totally sure I believe that the universe is ordered by providence, Epictetus really admired Diogenes for his integrity. Like, I don't think he would put him out of his school and say, well, you're an idiot. You couldn't possibly become a Stoic. Like, you have to believe this rigid set of theological dogmas in order to be a Stoic. I think the Stoics see the theology as something that's up for debate, and it's a conclusion that they arrive at on the basis of their philosophical reasoning. It's not something necessarily that's to be treated as kind of carved in stone. I think some Stoics treated it probably as more self-evident or more fundamental than others, but they must have recognized that there were others who disagreed with them. And for all Stoics, virtue is the most important thing. It doesn't seem to me that they believe. Marcus Aurelius actually explicitly says 9 times in the Meditations that whether the universe is ordered by providence or whether it's the random collision of atoms, either way, Stoic philosophy is still valid with regard to the nature of virtue. So in order to believe in virtue and understand virtue and live in accord with it, you don't have to believe in providence. You could believe in Epicurean metaphysics, for example, or be agnostic about which one is right. He says that repeatedly throughout the Meditations. That's not to say that Marcus Aurelius doesn't believe in providence. He does, but he's open. I think people get quite confused by the difference. But, in fact, I can see people over and over again get really confused about this distinction. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca all believe in providence, right? But I don't think that necessarily means that they think they're not Christians. It's not based on faith for them. It's not religious dogma in that sense. They're open-minded about the possibility that there might be other ways of viewing the universe. And they believe that the Stoic philosophy of virtue is the most important thing, and even if somebody disagreed with their beliefs about providence or was unsure about it or agnostic about it, they could still exhibit virtue and still be a Stoic moral exemplar, while holding different theological views.
I think there's different terms as well. I don't know whether that's significant in that sort of belief, where you can say, nature or universe or providence, or, I don't know whether that's deliberate in the sense that, you can have different sources for that, or whether it all just relates to the same thing. But yeah, that's all I had, Donald. That was great. I really enjoyed that. Is there anything you'd like to say finally about the book?
Yeah, I think, I thought this book was impossible to write. And then I gradually changed my mind, because I think a lot about the books that I would have wanted to read when I was 17 years old, when I was first kind of just beginning to get into philosophy and stuff like that. And I really think about that very deeply, and I visualize it repeatedly. And, what struck me was that I thought there's a story. When I read the Socratic dialogues and the anecdotes, it seemed to me I can see a story here that I think most classicists and scholars of ancient philosophy can see. And it's a really cool story, but no one kind of is willing to tell you the story, because there's some ambiguities and contradictions in it. It gets real boring real quickly, like trying to kind of figure out certain dates for sure. So it easily fall in the trap of writing an academic history, which is of great value to academics. But the cool story that really inspired people for 500 years in the ancient world gets kind of submerged under that and lost if we're not careful. And so when I really visualized this, I thought my 17-year-old self wouldn't benefit from an academic history that kind of really tries to evaluate all the evidence meticulously. It'd probably just bore him, right? Now, those books are valuable, but not for everybody. I thought my 17-year-old self would have wanted something that was like a movie, that really made Socrates come to life for him, like as a character, in the way that Socrates was a three-dimensional character for Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. When Epictetus says, you guys should become like Socrates, and, he's constantly badgering his students to emulate Socrates. Epictetus had never met Socrates, right? He means the Socrates in Plato's Apology, the Socrates in all the anecdotes. They had, these stories were very familiar to them from the culture that they lived in. They'd grown up hearing about Socrates. He was a meme, a trope in their culture. And so he seemed like a very familiar three-dimensional being to him. He was a type of person, kind of like an archetype in a way. So Epictetus is saying, you should emulate, as if they already know who Socrates is. Whereas we kind of tear our hair out and think, but I don't know if we really know who he actually was. And so we're blinded. We lose that archetype, meme, trope, whatever you want to call it. We don't know who Epictetus wanted his students to emulate, because we get sidetracked by the Socratic problem. Basically, it's like a smokescreen to us. So I thought my 70-year-old self would want to know, yeah, but who's this Socrates that Epictetus is going on about? He'd never met him. Who has he gone on about then? Who is the Socrates that appears to us in the literary sources? Who is the literary character of Socrates that these guys love and look up to and want to emulate? And so I thought, I just need to bite the bullet. The thing that sealed it for me was I thought there could be a movie about Socrates. And if I approach writing this book as if I'm writing a dramatization or a movie, so some characters would need to be combined. There's some speculation that we'd need to do. There's some gaps that need to be filled in. There's some contradictions that need to be ignored or resolved somehow. there's certain things that need to be abbreviated in order to turn this into a movie. But Marcus Aurelius had that movie in his head. Epictetus had that movie in his head. Seneca had that movie in his head. They'd grown up with it. So I thought, I need to turn it back into that format, so that, a new generation of people today that are interested in ancient philosophy could think, I know who Socrates is. I get it, right? Like, I understand what sort of person he was. And that, to me, provides an on-ramp to get people onto the highway of, like, the Platonic dialogues and Xenophon's dialogues and the anecdotes, Diogenes Laertius and so on. So if someone read my book and then they thought, I reckon I could go and read Plato's Apology now, like, I feel like that's my work done. In a way, it's like I'd be writing cliff notes for Shakespeare's Hamlet or something. I see my job is helping people regain access to classic texts that they've become alienated from, So if somebody watched the movie Romeo and Juliet, or, with Leonardo DiCaprio, or what's his name, Hamlet with Mel Gibson, and they thought, this is a cool movie, but it's kind of an abridged version of Shakespeare and stuff like that. But it made them feel like they might be able to then go and read the play, right? Then I think that's a good thing. So these ideas were more accessible to people. Everyone had read Plato's Apology. Like, it was a really familiar text in the ancient world. It's not that difficult to read today. It's quite short. So, like, that's what I wanted to say to people. My goal was to write something that would be easy to read and reach a wider audience, and then hopefully prompt, maybe not everybody, but that prompt a lot of people and give them the confidence to think that they could then go and read Xenophon and Plato for themselves.
I think related to that, it's a great companion to How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, which I'm sure probably prompted a lot of people to go on and read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations too.
Here's the problem. So publishers want these, like, if these books come in threes, right? But I've run out of ideas. So I don't know, like, if people would want, right? So we could have How to Think Like a Roman Slave and make it about Epictetus. Or I don't know if anyone would buy that, So I'm starting now and trying to think. I don't have any ideas for a third book. There might be 2 books in this series.
So I'll be waiting for the third one.
Definitely. Yeah, let me know if you come up with any ideas, like, for about, who the third book could be about.
Excellent. I'll have a think about that. Thanks for your time, Donald. That was really, really interesting.
You're welcome. Been a pleasure.